The town of Ravenswood nestled itself into the thick, whispering forests of southeastern Ohio, perched just close enough to Salt Fork State Park to breathe its wild air. On the surface, it seemed unremarkable, a town of modest homes, mom-and-pop diners, and a single main street dotted with shops that stubbornly resisted the pull of modernity. Children rode bikes down cobblestone paths, their laughter ringing out like wind chimes in the distance. At first glance, life in Ravenswood appeared ordinary, almost idyllic. But beneath the surface, there was an unease, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air like the mist that often rolled off the park's dark woods. To outsiders, it might have seemed like nothing more than rural superstition, yet for the townsfolk, the forests surrounding their home had always held an air of mystery, of foreboding. Salt Fork State Park was more than a weekend escape or a picturesque destination. It was a place with a memory, a long, dark memory that never fully faded, no matter how much time passed. It began with the silence, not the tranquil kind, but a heavy, oppressive hush that would creep over the town like a storm cloud when the sun dipped below the horizon. In Ravenswood, nightfall wasn't greeted with comfort or rest. Doors were locked, curtains drawn tight, and lights extinguished early. Even the stray dogs that roamed the alleys during the day would vanish into hiding as the shadows lengthened. Those brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk the streets at dusk often spoke of an eerie sensation, as though unseen eyes were watching from the treetops just beyond the town's edge. "It's just the woods," people would say, their voices tinged with forced cheer. Woods have a way of playing tricks on you. But the older residents knew better. They whispered among themselves about strange happenings over the decades. Livestock that vanished without a trace, boot prints too large for any human, and guttural howls that shattered the quiet of the night. They claimed that the woods had been different since long before the town was even founded, back when the land was untouched and the native tribes avoided certain areas with reverent fear. There was something primal out there, they said. Something the world had forgotten or chosen to forget. Martha Caldwell, a widow in her 70s, would shake her head whenever the topic arose. She was one of the few who still remembered the summer of 1963 when her cousin Danny never came back from a camping trip in the park. They found his tent shredded and his belongings scattered, but Danny was never seen again. "The forest doesn't forgive," she'd mutter, sipping her tea by the window. "Not everything belongs to us." For the most part, the younger generation dismissed these stories as the ramblings of overactive imaginations. After all, nothing had happened in years. But in Ravenswood, everyone followed the unspoken rules, just in case. No one ventured into the woods alone after dark. No one lingered at the park once the sky turned. And everyone, even the skeptics, shivered a little when the wind rustled the trees in the dead of night. Still, life went on. The town lived in a careful balance with the forest, an unspoken truce that no one dared to test. But the air had been changing lately, carrying with it a tension that wasn't there before. Ravenswood didn't know it yet, but something was coming. Something that would shatter the fragile peace they'd clung to for so long. As the sun set over the quiet streets and the shadows swallowed the edges of the park, the woods seemed to whisper a warning, one that no one was ready to hear. The growing tension in Ravenswood didn't go unnoticed by Dr. Arthur Hensley, a historian who had recently taken up residence in town. Arthur was a meticulous man, drawn to forgotten places and the secrets they buried. He'd come to the area for what he thought would be a quiet research project, a deep dive into the folklore surrounding Salt Fork State Park. At first, he thought of it as nothing more than quaint local tales spun to entertain tourists. But as the days stretched into weeks, he found himself immersed in something much darker. The library in Ravenswood was small, but surprisingly well-stocked with old records and journals from the town's early years. Arthur spent his afternoons combing through dusty ledgers, weathered maps, and cryptic diaries. It was during one of these sessions that he stumbled across a collection of accounts from the late 1800s, written by a man named Silas Grady, a name that carried no significance until now. Silas, it seemed, had been one of the earliest settlers in the area and a self-appointed chronicler of the town's formative years. His writings began innocuously enough, describing the clearing of the land, the construction of cabins, and the hardships of frontier life. But as Arthur read on, the tone shifted. The later entries spoke of disappearances, hunters who never returned, entire families who vanished overnight. Silas attributed these events to the beast, though he never provided a clear description. Instead, his words painted an impression of something massive, primal, and deeply hostile. One entry dated November 13th, 1878, chilled Arthur to the bone. "We cannot make sense of it. Found the remains of Jonas's horse near the ravine. It was torn asunder as though by claws the size of daggers. We do not speak of it openly, but all know the truth. The woods are not ours. We are trespassers, and the beast reminds us when we stray too far. If there is a way to appease it, we have forgotten it. If there is salvation, it does not dwell here." Arthur rubbed his temples, the words gnawing at him like a splinter lodged deep in his mind. This wasn't a whimsical tale meant to scare children. It read more like a warning. Yet, Silas's entries stopped abruptly in 1880, leaving a final cryptic note. "They come at night. Always at night. I hear them now, scraping, clawing, breathing. God forgive us for what we have woken." What struck Arthur most was how closely Silas's descriptions mirrored the stories he'd heard from modern-day residents of Ravenswood. The guttural howls, the impossible footprints, the way the air seemed to press down on you as night fell. It wasn't just an old tale passed through generations, it was a pattern, recurring again and again, spanning over a century. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that these stories, separated by time but eerily similar, weren't coincidences. The accounts, the entries, the warnings, they all seemed to point to something real, something lurking in the woods that had no intention of staying hidden forever. That night, as Arthur walked home through the dimly lit streets, he couldn't help but glance at the tree line on the edge of town. The forest was silent, as always, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted. It was the kind that watched, that waited. And as he reached his porch and fumbled with his keys, he thought he heard something distant, carried faintly on the wind. A howl, deep, guttural, and unlike anything he'd ever heard before. Arthur froze, his heart pounding in his chest, but the sound didn't come again. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that whatever had haunted Silas Grady's time hadn't vanished. It had only been waiting. The next morning, Arthur sat at his desk, the faint gray light of dawn spilling through the thin curtains of his small rented home. He had barely slept, his mind restless with the weight of what he'd uncovered. The sound he thought he'd heard last night, it couldn't have been real. At least, that's what he tried to convince himself as he brewed a strong cup of coffee to shake off the fatigue. But there were others in Ravenswood who weren't dismissing the unease so easily. Across town, Anna Larkin, who ran the local feed store, was tending to her backyard garden when she noticed something strange. The wooden fence that bordered her property, strong and sturdy for years, had been damaged overnight. Long, deep grooves were carved into the wood, as though it had been raked by enormous claws. She called out to her husband Paul, her voice sharp with worry. "What do you think could have done this?" she asked, pointing to the jagged tiers. Paul crouched down, squinting at the marks in the pale morning light. He was a practical man, quick to dismiss wild ideas, but even he seemed uneasy. "Bear, maybe," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "Or, I don't know, could have been a big cat." But Anna wasn't so sure. She'd grown up in these woods and had never seen a bear this close to town, let alone anything that left marks like these. Later that day, Paul headed into town to replace the damaged wood. When he mentioned the incident to the others at the hardware store, it triggered a ripple of unease. He wasn't the only one who'd noticed strange things that morning. The Baxter family, who lived near the northern edge of the park, had found their chicken coop torn apart, feathers scattered like confetti across the yard. Not a single chicken was left. Meanwhile, a group of teens riding their bikes along the outskirts of the forest stumbled across a series of massive footprints in the mud. Each print was at least twice the size of a man's boot, with clawed toes pressed deep into the earth. "They're fake," one of the boys said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to sound confident. "Someone's messing with us." But none of them dared follow the trail into the woods to find out. By noon, whispers of these strange occurrences spread through Ravenswood like wildfire. At the diner, the older residents muttered darkly about the past. Martha Caldwell shook her head as she stirred her coffee, her expression grim. "I told you," she said, her voice low. "The woods don't like us poking around. They never have." Arthur overheard these conversations as he passed through town on his way to the library. The unease was palpable now, the sap hanging over the townsfolk like a storm about to break. His curiosity drove him to dig deeper into Silas Grady's journals, hoping to uncover some thread, some clue that might explain what was happening. But the more he read, the more he felt the chilling realization that this wasn't just a relic of the past. The warnings weren't buried history, they were a cycle, a pattern. And now, for reasons Arthur couldn't yet understand, that cycle seemed to be starting again. As the sun dipped lower that evening, a strange tension fell over the town. People locked their doors earlier than usual, their glances toward the forest more frequent, more wary. Ravenswood felt different tonight. The kind of different that made your skin prickle and your breath quicken, even when nothing was there. At least nothing they could see. As the evening deepened, the weight of unease in Ravenswood grew heavier. Clouds rolled in from the west, blotting out the stars and casting the town in an unnatural gloom. Arthur sat at his desk, the dim glow of his desk lamp barely holding the shadows at bay. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through another of Silas Grady's brittle journal pages. Each word felt like it carried a warning meant for him. It was written over a century ago. A sudden, sharp knock at the door broke the silence, making him flinch. His pulse quickened as he hesitated, unsure of what to expect. Peering through the window, he saw Sheriff Nolan standing on his porch, his broad frame silhouetted by the faint glow of a street lamp. "Arthur," the sheriff said when the door opened, his voice grave. "We need to talk." Arthur invited him in, gesturing toward the cluttered table littered with notes and old journals. Nolan glanced at the chaotic spread but didn't comment. Instead, he sank into the chair across from Arthur, his weathered face lined with tension. "We've had reports all day," Nolan began, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Livestock gone, fences torn up, and now this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, unfolding it to reveal a photo. It showed a series of deep claw marks gouged into the hood of a truck. Arthur studied the image, his stomach twisting. "That looks deliberate," he murmured, choosing his words carefully. "That's what I'm afraid of," Nolan replied, his tone low. "This isn't some bear or a prank. Too many things are happening all at once." Arthur leaned back, his mind racing. "Sheriff, I've been researching the town's history. There are patterns, cycles of strange activity, always centered around Salt Fork State Park. It's been going on for over a century, maybe longer. Whatever's happening now, it's not random." Nolan's eyes narrowed. "You think it's connected to those old stories?" "I don't just think," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "I know it is. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I don't think it'll be the last." The sheriff sighed heavily, his gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I'll tell you this. People are scared. They've been calling all day, and I've got nothing to tell them. If we don't figure this out fast, it's only going to get worse." As they spoke, the distant sound of a dog barking cut through the night. It was sharp, frantic, the kind of barking that made your hairs stand on end. Both men froze, listening. Then, as abruptly as it started, the barking stopped. Arthur and Nolan exchanged a tense look. "That came from near the park," Nolan said, standing abruptly. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Arthur said, grabbing his coat. "I'm coming with you. If there's something out there, we need to see it with our own eyes." Nolan hesitated, but finally nodded. Together, they stepped out into the night, the air heavy with moisture and the faint scent of pine. As they made their way toward the edge of town, the silence pressed in around them like a living thing. Arthur's heart pounded as they approached the dark outline of the forest, its towering trees like sentinels guarding an ancient secret. They stopped at the trailhead, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the oppressive darkness. "Whatever's out here," Nolan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, "let's hope it doesn't want to be found." Arthur's grip tightened on the flashlight. Deep in the woods, a sound reached them, low, guttural, and impossibly far away, yet it vibrated in their chests like thunder. Neither man spoke, but the unspoken truth hung between them. Something was out there, and it was watching. The sound echoed in the stillness, low and resonant, almost like a growl wrapped in a deep, unearthly rumble. Arthur froze, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Beside him, Nolan's face hardened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "Did you hear that?" Arthur whispered, his breath visible in the damp, chilled air. "Hard to miss," Nolan replied, his voice taut. He unholstered his sidearm, the metallic click unnervingly loud against the suffocating silence. "Stay close. We'll check the clearing up ahead." Arthur nodded, his stomach churning as they moved deeper into the woods. The flashlight beams cut through the dense canopy, the light bouncing off gnarled branches and catching fleeting glints of dew on the underbrush. The trail beneath their feet was soft, almost muddy, but their footsteps seemed impossibly loud to Arthur's ears, as though the woods were amplifying their every move. When they reached the clearing, Nolan stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal Arthur to halt. The air here felt heavier, almost electric, and the faint scent of iron lingered. Nolan's flashlight swept across the ground, revealing a scattered mess of trampled grass, overturned soil, and something else. Something darker, glistening under the light. "Blood," Nolan said, crouching to get a closer look. The reddish smear streaked across the dirt and grass, leading deeper into the woods. "A lot of it." Arthur's pulse quickened. "It's fresh," he said, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but the rational part of his mind rejected the notion. This wasn't the work of any predator he knew. Before they could decide their next move, a sharp crack rang out, a branch snapping underfoot somewhere nearby. Both men swung their flashlights toward the sound, but the beams revealed only dense foliage and shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with the movement of the leaves. Arthur's throat tightened as he tried to focus, certain that something was out there, just beyond the reach of their light. Then it came again, the sound, low, guttural, and impossibly close this time. Arthur instinctively took a step back, bumping into Nolan, whose grip on his weapon tightened. "Show yourself!" Nolan shouted, his voice firm but edged with desperation. The woods swallowed the command, offering no reply. A flicker of movement to their left made Arthur whirl, his flashlight catching a brief glimpse of something massive slipping through the trees. His brain struggled to process what he'd seen, a hulking form, broad and covered in a texture that looked more like fur than skin. It moved with a terrifying grace, silent despite its size. "Did you see that?" Arthur gasped, his voice breaking. "I saw it," Nolan said grimly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay close to me." Another branch snapped, this time on their right, then another behind them. The sounds began to multiply, coming from every direction, as though the forest itself had come alive with movement. Arthur's breath hitched, and he fought the urge to run, knowing instinctively that fleeing would only make them prey. "Back to the car," Nolan ordered, his voice steady but urgent. "Now." They began to retreat, moving quickly but cautiously, their flashlights swinging wildly as the noises seemed to follow, relentless and closing in. Arthur's chest burned with panic, each step feeling slower than the last. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached Nolan's patrol car, Arthur nearly collapsed against the door, his legs trembling. As Nolan fumbled with the keys, another sound emerged from the woods, a piercing, bone-chilling scream, unlike anything Arthur had ever heard. It was primal, enraged, and sent a shiver down his spine that he would never forget. The engine roared to life, and Nolan hit the gas, the tires spitting gravel as they sped away from the park. Neither of them spoke during the ride back to town, the weight of what they had encountered settling heavily between them. Arthur stared out the window, the trees blurring past, and knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in those woods wasn't finished with them. By the time Nolan pulled the patrol car into Ravenswood's main street, the town was cloaked in an uneasy quiet. The handful of street lights cast long, faintly flickering beams across the empty sidewalks. Arthur's hands still shook as he fumbled with the door handle, stepping out onto the pavement with unsteady legs. He glanced back toward the dark outline of the woods, still visible in the distance, as if expecting the hulking figure they'd seen to emerge at any moment. "Get inside," Nolan muttered, his voice low but commanding. He locked the car and guided Arthur toward the sheriff's office, a squat brick building that served as the hub of the town's limited law enforcement. Once inside, Nolan closed the door, locking it firmly before flipping on the lights. Arthur collapsed into a chair, his pulse still racing. He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind, the blood-soaked clearing, the shadowy movement, and most of all, that scream. Raw, animalistic, and laced with fury. It echoed in his ears, as vivid as if it were still reverberating through the trees. What the hell was that? Arthur finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. You saw it, Nolan. You heard it. That wasn't normal. Nolan paced the room, his jaw tight and his hands clenched into fists. I don't know what I saw, he said after a long pause, his tone edged with frustration. But whatever it is, it's dangerous, and it's close. Arthur leaned forward, tacked his elbows on his knees. This isn't new. This thing, whatever it is, has been here before. The stories, the records, it's been haunting this place for over a century. I don't think it's just some animal. The sheriff stopped pacing, turning to face Arthur. I don't care if it's Bigfoot, a bear, or something else entirely. What matters is keeping this town safe. He hesitated, then added, but you're right about one thing. It's not just some coincidence. This thing isn't wandering through. It's staying. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but the ringing of the office phone cut through the tension. Nolan snatched it up quickly. Sheriff's office, he said, his voice sharp and professional. As the person on the other end spoke, Nolan's expression darkened. He nodded, scribbled something on a notepad, and hung up without a word. What now? Arthur asked, though he could already tell from Nolan's grim face that it wasn't good. Jim Baxter, Nolan said, grabbing his jacket. He just called from his farm near the north side of the park. Says he saw something moving in his field. Something big. Arthur felt his stomach knot. It's hunting, he said quietly, or testing its boundaries. Nolan didn't respond, already heading for the door. Arthur followed, unwilling to stay behind despite the fear clawing at his chest. The drive to Baxter's farm was tense and silent, the narrow road winding through dense woods before opening into a wide stretch of farmland. When they arrived, Jim was waiting on the porch, a rifle clutched in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened fields. It's out there, he said as they stepped out of the car. I saw it, at least, I think I did. Too dark to make out much, but it was moving fast, way faster than anything I've ever seen. Nolan glanced at Arthur, then back at Jim. Where? Jim pointed toward the far end of the field, where the forest loomed like a black wall. There, near the tree line. The three of them stood in silence, staring into the void. Then, just as Arthur was about to speak, a low, resonant growl drifted across the field, sending a shiver down his spine. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. The growl lingered in the air, a guttural vibration that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath their feet. Arthur tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles white against the cold metal. Nolan stepped forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, scanning the darkened tree line with sharp, deliberate movements. Stay close, Nolan said, his voice steady but low. He glanced back at Jim, who still clutched his rifle with trembling hands. Don't fire unless you're sure. We don't need to panic it. Panic it? Jim whispered harshly, his voice barely audible over the rustling wind. Sheriff, that thing isn't gonna panic. It's gonna kill. Arthur swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He couldn't argue. The growl had felt purposeful, almost territorial, and the oppressive darkness beyond the fields felt alive with unseen movement. The night was silent again, except for the faint rustle of leaves and the soft hum of insects in the distance. But even that felt wrong, too subdued, as though the natural world itself was holding its breath. Do we have a spotlight? Arthur asked, his voice shaking slightly. Something that can reach the tree line? Jim nodded. In the barn. I'll grab it. Before anyone could object, he darted off toward the shadowy outline of the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel. Arthur turned to Nolan. You think it's waiting for us to make the first move? Nolan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the tree line, his eyes narrowing. It's testing us, he said finally, seeing how far it can push before we break. The words sent a chill through Arthur. Testing them. That thought carried an intelligence he didn't want to associate with the creature they were dealing with. It wasn't acting like an animal, it was acting like a predator. Jim returned moments later, lugging a heavy spotlight. This should do it, he said, setting it down and fumbling with the cord. Nolan helped him steady it, and with a loud hum, the bulb flared to life, cutting a brilliant beam through the inky darkness. The light swept across the field, illuminating tall grass and patches of disturbed earth. As it reached the tree line, the tension peaked. The beam caught something, a flash of movement, low and fast, slipping between the trunks. Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. "There!" he shouted, pointing. Nolan swung the light back, but whatever had been there was gone. "Damn it!" Nolan muttered, gripping his flashlight tightly. "It's toying with us." Jim cursed under his breath, his hands trembling visibly now. "I'm not just standing here," he said, raising his rifle. "No!" Nolan barked, stepping in front of him. "You fire now, and it might come straight at us. We don't know what we're dealing with." Arthur's eyes darted between the tree line and the horizon. The spotlight's beam swept back and forth, revealing nothing but shifting shadows and swaying branches. And then it happened. A sharp, splintering crack from the woods, followed by a deep, echoing thud. "What was that?" Arthur asked, his voice tight. "Tree," Nolan said grimly. "It's breaking them." As if on cue, another crack split the air, this time closer. The sound was deafening, and Arthur's stomach dropped. Whatever was in those woods wasn't just watching. It was moving, coming closer, and asserting its dominance in the most primal way possible. The three men stood frozen. The spotlight now focused on the edge of the forest, where the darkness seemed to writhe and ripple with unseen motion. A heavy silence fell over them, broken only by the sound of Jim's uneven breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling began again. Louder this time. Closer. It rumbled like distant thunder, a warning that sent an unmistakable message. This was its territory. Arthur felt the weight of that truth settle over him like a physical force. They weren't just facing a creature, they were trespassing in a world that belonged to it. And now it was letting them know they had gone too far. The growl crescendoed into a chilling roar, echoing across the field with a ferocity that turned every muscle in Arthur's body to stone. It wasn't just a sound, it was a primal declaration, a claim over the land and everything on it. For a moment, none of them moved, rooted in place by the overwhelming presence of whatever lay hidden in the woods. "Turn off the spotlight," Nolan said suddenly, his voice tight. Jim spun to him, incredulous. "Are you insane? That's the only thing keeping it back." Nolan's jaw tightened. "It's not keeping anything back. It's just drawing its attention. If we're lucky, maybe the dark will make it retreat." Arthur doubted it. Whatever was out there wasn't retreating. It was advancing, steadily, deliberately. The growls hadn't stopped, but shifted into a low rumble that rolled across the field like a warning drumbeat. Still, he hesitated to argue. Logic seemed irrelevant here, dwarfed by a primal fear that gnawed at the edges of his reason. Reluctantly, Jim reached down and flipped the switch. The spotlight blinked off, plunging them back into the oppressive dark. For a moment, Arthur's senses were overwhelmed, his eyes strained against the blackness, and his ears caught every tiny rustle and creak in the distance. The wind pressed cold against his skin, carrying with it the faint, sickly scent of something foul and unfamiliar. "It's not leaving," Arthur whispered, breaking the tense silence. As if in answer, another sound reached them, slow, heavy footfalls distinct against the muffling earth. They were rhythmic, deliberate, growing louder with each step. Whatever was approaching wasn't in a hurry. It had no need to rush. "Back to the porch," Nolan ordered, his voice low and firm. "We make a stand there." Arthur and Jim obeyed, their movements clumsy as their nerves frayed. They reached the relative safety of the wooden steps, the creaking boards beneath their feet, a strange comfort against the silence of the field. Nolan positioned himself near the door, his flashlight in one hand, his weapon in the other. "What are we dealing with?" Jim hissed, his voice thick with panic. "This isn't a bear. This isn't anything natural." Arthur didn't answer, because he couldn't. His mind flickered back to the journals, to Silas Grady's frantic descriptions of the beast and the blood-stained warnings scrawled in the margins. Whatever Silas had encountered more than a century ago, it was here again. And it hadn't weakened. If anything, it had grown bolder. A low rustling noise reached them, accompanied by a faint, unnatural vibration that seemed to hum in Arthur's chest. His eyes strained to pierce the dark, catching nothing but the faint outline of the tree line in the distance. And then it happened. A shape emerged. It was massive, far larger than any bear or man, moving with a strange, fluid grace that defied its bulk. The moonlight caught glimpses of it, long limbs, thick fur, and eyes that reflected a cold, eerie glint. For a second, Arthur thought they were glowing, but it was something worse. Intelligence. This was no mindless predator. It was calculating, deliberate, and terrifyingly aware of their presence. Jim raised his rifle, but his hands were trembling so badly he couldn't keep it steady. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The creature paused, tilting its head as if amused by the futile display. Then it let out a sharp, guttural bark, a sound so alien and violent that Arthur flinched, his grip tightening on the porch railing. The sound sent another wave of tension rippling through the air. The message was clear. This was a warning. A final one. "We need to leave," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nolan shook his head, his jaw set. "We don't run. Not yet." The creature shifted its weight, its massive form almost blending back into the shadows. Arthur prayed it would disappear entirely, retreating back into whatever hellish depths it had come from. But as the growling resumed, deep and menacing, he knew it wasn't going anywhere. And neither were they. The growl intensified, a guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden planks of the porch. Arthur's breath caught as the creature stepped closer, its hulking silhouette growing more defined with each calculated movement. The pale light of the moon caught the coarse, matted fur that covered its massive frame, and for the first time, Arthur could truly comprehend its size. It was monstrous, towering over any man, broad-shouldered and primal, yet with an air of unsettling intelligence. Jim's hands were trembling so violently that the barrel of his rifle wavered, his breath hitching in shallow gasps. "I'll shoot," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, I'll shoot." "Hold your fire," Nolan said sharply, his eyes locked on the creature. "Don't provoke it." "Provoke it?" Jim snapped, his voice high with fear. "It's already here. What more do you need?" The creature took another step forward, and Arthur's grip on the porch railing tightened. He tried to focus, to think of anything he'd read in the journals that might offer a solution, but his mind was a chaotic swirl of fear and disbelief. There were no answers, no strategies. All he could do was stare at the impossible thing before him and pray it wasn't as unstoppable as it looked. Nolan raised his flashlight, the beam catching the creature's face for the first time. Arthur's stomach lurched. Its eyes were deep-set, reflecting the light with a cold, unnatural gleam. The face wasn't entirely human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It was a disturbing blend of both, with a wide, flat nose and a mouth filled with teeth that glinted sharp and white in the darkness. The creature stopped, tilting its head slightly as if assessing them. The motion was unnervingly deliberate, like a predator sizing up prey. For a fleeting moment, Arthur thought it might retreat, that perhaps it was more curious than hostile. But then it roared. The sound was deafening, a guttural explosion that sent a shockwave through the air. Arthur staggered back, his hands flying to his ears as the force of the roar vibrated through his chest. Jim screamed, raising the rifle, and fired a single, wild shot. The bullet struck the ground just in front of the creature, kicking up a small puff of dirt. The effect was immediate. The creature lunged forward, its massive frame moving with a speed that defied its size. In 2 strides, it crossed the distance to the edge of the field, its claws glinting in the moonlight. "Inside!" Nolan shouted, shoving Arthur toward the door. "Now!" Jim scrambled backward, dropping the rifle in his panic as the 3 of them crashed through the doorway and into the farmhouse. Nolan slammed the door shut and bolted it, his face pale but determined. Arthur pressed himself against the wall, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. Outside, the creature howled again, a sound so filled with rage and power that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Arthur glanced toward the window, his heart hammering as he saw the shadowy outline of the creature pacing just beyond the porch, its massive form illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. "What do we do?" Jim whimpered, his voice barely audible. "It's gonna tear this place apart." Nolan's jaw tightened. "We hold out. We don't give it a reason to come in." Arthur wasn't sure how much longer they could last. The creature wasn't retreating. It was waiting. Testing them. And with every passing moment, it seemed to grow more confident, its growls deepening into a steady rhythm that filled the silence like a war drum. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a beast. It was something more, something ancient, and Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just intruding on its territory, they were intruding on its hunt. The house groaned under the weight of the creature's presence, its deep growls reverberating through the walls like distant thunder. Arthur pressed his back harder against the wall, his breath shallow as he tried to listen past the relentless pounding of his heartbeat. The creature's pacing on the porch was slow and deliberate, each heavy footfall a reminder of just how trapped they were. Jim sat slumped against the kitchen counter, his face pale and shiny with sweat. He was muttering under his breath, a litany of curses and prayers tumbling together as his hands shook uncontrollably. The rifle lay discarded on the floor, useless now that the creature knew it wasn't facing any real threat. Arthur's eyes flicked to it, wondering if it would even matter. Would a direct shot slow something like this down, or only make it angrier? Nolan stood near the door, his flashlight still in hand. The light flickered slightly, its batteries weakened by overuse, and the sight made Arthur's stomach tighten. "What now?" he asked, his voice hushed but desperate. "We can't stay here. That thing's not gonna leave." Nolan didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted toward the boarded windows. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "If we run, it'll chase us, and I don't think we'd get far." Outside, the creature stopped pacing. The silence that followed was worse than the growling. It stretched on, thick and oppressive, wrapping around them like a noose. Arthur found himself straining to hear anything, the faintest hint of movement, the sound of breath. But there was nothing. Then came the scratching. It started softly, a subtle scrape against the door. Arthur's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse spiking. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, the harsh scrape of claws on wood setting his teeth on edge. It moved up and down the length of the door, the testing, probing. Jim let out a small, choked sob. "It's trying to get in," he whispered. "Quiet," Nolan snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through Jim's panic. "Don't give it any reason." The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by another sound, a low, rhythmic breathing that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. Arthur's skin prickled as he realized how close it was, just inches away on the other side of the door. The air inside the house grew heavy, the tension unbearable. Without warning, the creature let out a sharp, deafening bang against the door. The wood splintered slightly, the frame groaning under the impact. Arthur jumped, his hands instinctively reaching out to steady himself. Nolan raised his weapon, pointing it at the door, his eyes locked on the shaking frame. Another bang, harder this time. The door bowed inward, and the hinges screamed in protest. Arthur's mind raced. If the creature got in, there would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They would be at its mercy. "We need to distract it," Arthur said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Draw it away from the house." "And go where?" Nolan shot back, his voice tight with barely restrained fear. "Out there, we're as good as dead." "We're dead in here, too," Arthur hissed, his voice rising. "At least out there, we have a chance." Before anyone could respond, another massive blow struck the door, splintering it further. This time, the creature let out a guttural snarl, a sound of pure frustration and fury. It wasn't testing anymore, it was committing. Nolan made a decision. "Upstairs," he ordered, his voice firm. "Now, we'll barricade ourselves and figure this out." Arthur and Jim didn't argue. They scrambled toward the staircase, their footsteps pounding against the wood as they ascended. Behind them, the door finally gave way, the crash of splintering wood followed by a deafening silence. Arthur didn't dare look back. Whatever had just entered the house wasn't human. It wasn't even entirely animal, it was something worse. And now it was inside. The upstairs hallway was narrow and dim, its only illumination coming from the pale moonlight spilling through a single cracked window at the far end. Arthur stumbled into the room at the top of the stairs, followed closely by Jim and Nolan, who slammed the door shut behind them. The sheriff braced his shoulder against the wood and motioned for Jim to help him with the heavy dresser that stood against the wall. "Push!" Nolan barked, and together they shoved the dresser in front of the door, the scraping sound of wood on wood echoing loudly in the otherwise silent space. Arthur scanned the room quickly. It was small, cluttered with old furniture and stacks of yellowing newspapers. A window on the opposite wall overlooked the fields, but it was far too high to be a viable escape route. They were trapped, and they all knew it. "What's the plan?" Arthur demanded, his voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to break in." Nolan straightened, his chest heaving from the effort of moving the dresser. "We hold out," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "It'll either lose interest or—" A thunderous crash from below interrupted him, followed by the sharp, metallic clatter of something heavy being overturned. Arthur flinched, his hands gripping the back of a chair, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "It's looking for us," Jim muttered, his voice barely audible. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his rifle resting limply in his lap. His eyes were wide, glassy with fear. "It knows we're here." Arthur took a shaky breath, trying to push past the panic clawing at his mind. "It's not just an animal," he said, his voice low but urgent. "It's hunting us, but not out of hunger. This is something else, territorial, maybe even personal." Jim let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Personal? You think it cares who we are?" Arthur hesitated. He didn't know how to explain the intelligence he'd seen in the creature's eyes or the deliberate way it had stalked them. He only knew that it felt wrong, too calculated, too focused to be mindless aggression. Another crash echoed through the house, this time from the stairwell. The creature was moving closer. Arthur could hear its heavy footsteps, each one deliberate and unhurried, as if it were savoring the chase. His mind raced, searching for anything, any clue, any strategy that could buy them more time. "The journals," he said suddenly, turning to Nolan. "Silas Grady wrote about this. He mentioned ways to deter it. Light, sound, fire. We can use those." "Light?" Jim asked incredulously, gesturing at the single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. "We're not exactly equipped with floodlights here." Nolan's gaze flicked to the window. "We don't need to see it. We just need to keep it out. If it's territorial, maybe we can convince it that we're too much trouble." Arthur nodded, grasping at the idea. "We need noise, something loud. If we can scare it, even for a moment, it might retreat." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A low growl rumbled through the thin walls, sending a shiver down Arthur's spine. The dresser in front of the door creaked as the creature's weight pressed against it, testing the barrier. Nolan held up a hand, signaling for silence. They waited, every muscle tensed as the growling stopped. For a moment, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around them like a suffocating shroud. Then, with a sudden, violent crash, the door buckled inward, the wood splintering as the creature shoved against it. The dresser shifted, its heavy frame inching forward with each impact. "It's not stopping," Jim whispered, his voice quivering. Arthur felt the walls closing in, the oppressive reality of their situation threatening to crush him. They had nowhere to run, no way to fight. All they could do was hold on and hope the creature would tire before they did. But deep down, Arthur knew it wouldn't. This wasn't a creature that got tired. This was a predator, and they were its prey. The door groaned under the creature's relentless assault, each impact sending vibrations through the room. The dresser scraped against the floor, inching back with every bone-shaking blow. Arthur's heart raced as he searched the room for anything they could use to hold their ground. The oppressive darkness outside the window felt no safer than the monster trying to force its way in. Nolan grabbed the rifle from Jim's lap, his movements quick and deliberate. "When it breaks through," he said, his voice firm but low, "aim for its eyes. We don't stop shooting until it does." Jim nodded weakly, his face pale and slick with sweat. Arthur's mind raced. Shooting might slow it down, but he doubted they could stop something so massive with a few bullets. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice shaking. "Noise, fire, something to drive it off." Another crash sent the doorframe splintering, and the dresser jolted forward. Arthur grabbed one end, his hands slipping on the polished wood. "We can't hold it much longer," he shouted, panic rising in his throat. Nolan nodded grimly, his gaze fixed on the door. "Jim, grab the lantern, over there." He gestured to a dusty kerosene lamp on a shelf near the bed. Jim scrambled toward it, nearly tripping over a chair in his haste. "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Light it," Nolan said, his jaw tight. "If it gets through, we'll use the fire to keep it back." Arthur's stomach churned at the thought. Fire might buy them a few seconds, but it wouldn't stop the thing. Nothing they'd seen so far suggested it feared anything, least of all them. Jim fumbled with the lantern, his hands shaking as he struck a match and lit the wick. The warm, flickering glow filled the room, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Nolan took it from him, holding it up like a shield as the creature let out another deafening roar. The dresser shifted again, nearly toppling over. Arthur threw his weight against it, but it was no use. The doorframe splintered, and through the widening gap, he caught a glimpse of the creature's massive clawed hand. It was covered in coarse, matted fur, its fingers tipped with razor-sharp talons that gleamed in the firelight. "Move back," Nolan barked, yanking Arthur away from the door just as the dresser gave way. It crashed to the floor, and the door burst open, revealing the hulking form of the creature. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying than he'd imagined. Its sheer size dwarfed everything in the room, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through Arthur's chest like a physical blow. Nolan thrust the lantern forward, the flames licking against the creature's outstretched claws. For a moment it recoiled, letting out a sharp, guttural snarl. The firelight danced across its face, and Arthur saw something unexpected, a flicker of hesitation. Was it fear? Or something else? "Back!" Nolan shouted, swinging the lantern in a wide arc. The creature took a step back, its growls deepening into an almost frustrated rumble. It wasn't retreating, it was assessing, adapting. Was it? Arthur could feel it in the way it moved, its eyes darting between them and the flickering flames. "We can't keep this up," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "It's too smart. It's waiting for an opening." Jim pressed himself against the wall, clutching a chair as if it were a weapon. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature let out another roar, the sound shaking the walls and drowning out their thoughts. Arthur felt the air grow heavier, the room closing in around them. The creature wasn't retreating, it was testing them, pushing them to the brink, waiting for the moment when their resolve would shatter. And Arthur could feel that moment drawing closer. The lantern's flickering light danced erratically, casting distorted shadows across the room. The creature paused, its hulking form just beyond the threshold, its glowing eyes locked onto the flame. Arthur could see its breath puffing in heavy, deliberate bursts, the sound filling the room like a growling furnace. It wasn't retreating. If anything, it seemed to be studying them, calculating its next move. Nolan kept the lantern raised, stepping forward cautiously. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice carried more determination than confidence. The sheriff's arm trembled slightly, the strain of holding the lantern steady starting to show. The creature tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as if it understood the command and was choosing to ignore it. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it lunged forward, one massive claw swiping at the lantern. Nolan jumped back, the flames flaring briefly as the lantern wobbled in his grasp. Like Arthur's heart stopped as the beast growled, its frustration vibrating through the air. "Keep it together," Arthur shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and raising it like a shield. "Don't let it close the gap." But the creature wasn't simply charging blindly. It was testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses, like a predator circling wounded prey. Its movements were almost methodical, its steps deliberate as it shifted its focus between Nolan, Jim, and Arthur. Suddenly, Jim broke. With a strangled cry, he darted toward the doorframe, clutching the kerosene lamp in trembling hands. "Get away from us!" he screamed, hurling the lamp at the creature. The glass shattered against its shoulder, dousing it in flaming liquid. For a moment, the fire roared to life, licking up its fur and illuminating the room in a blinding, fiery burst. The creature howled, a sound so piercing and filled with rage that Arthur felt his knees weaken. It staggered back, thrashing wildly as it clawed at the flames. The smell of burning hair and flesh filled the air, acrid and suffocating. But the fire, though fierce, was fleeting. The creature rolled against the doorframe, smothering the flames with terrifying efficiency. Its snarls deepened, its movements growing more erratic and furious. "You've pissed it off," Nolan yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get upstairs, now!" Arthur grabbed Jim by the arm, pulling him toward the second flight of stairs leading to the attic. "Move," he shouted, dragging the panicked man as the creature slammed against the doorway. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of its rage. Nolan was the last to retreat, tossing the spent lantern at the creature to buy a few precious seconds. It shattered at its feet, momentarily startling the beast, but doing little to slow its relentless advance. Go, 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 go! He bellowed as he raced after Arthur and Jim. The three of them scrambled into the attic, slamming the trapdoor shut behind them. Nolan shoved an old trunk over the door, piling anything he could find to create a makeshift barricade. Arthur pressed himself against the far wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Jim collapsed onto an old mattress, his face buried in his hands. Below them, the creature roared again, its fury shaking the beams overhead. Arthur clenched his fists, his mind racing. It's not stopping, he said, his voice tight with dread. It's going to tear the house apart. Nolan didn't respond. He was staring at the barricaded trapdoor, his face grim. We're running out of options. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the attic as the creature began its assault on the floor below. Arthur could feel every impact, each one closer and more forceful than the last. The walls seemed to close in around them, had the oppressive weight of the creature's presence suffocating. Arthur's eyes flicked to the small circular window at the far end of the attic. Beyond it, the forest loomed dark and silent. He felt a sickening twist in his gut as an idea formed, a desperate, reckless idea that might be their only chance. We need to lure it outside, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. If we stay here, we're dead. But if we can get it out in the open... Nolan turned to him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant understanding. You're talking about running straight into its territory. Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. It's our only shot. If it catches us in here, there's no way out. The floor beneath them cracked, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. The creature was coming, and time was running out. The floor beneath them groaned, the wood splintering as the creature's relentless assault shook the house. Dust rained down from the rafters, filling the cramped attic with the sharp scent of decay and old wood. Arthur's heart pounded as the weight of their predicament pressed down on him. The small window at the far end of the attic seemed to mock him. A slim chance of escape in an otherwise hopeless situation. Nolan's jaw tightened as he looked from the barricaded trapdoor to the window. You're right, he said, his voice strained but steady. If we stay here, it's over. But if we're going out there, we need a plan. Arthur nodded, his mind racing. We can use the fire. It hesitated when it saw the flames. Maybe we can use that to keep it at bay. Jim let out a bitter laugh, his face pale and drawn. We're going to run into the woods with nothing but matches against that thing? It'll tear us apart. Do you have a better idea? Nolan snapped, his eyes blazing, because sitting here is only delaying the inevitable. Jim fell silent, his head dropping into his hands. Arthur felt the tension crackling between them, but there was no time to let fear or doubt take hold. He crossed the room to the small window and peered out. The forest stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight, its shadows deep and impenetrable. Beyond the tree line, the fields were bathed in a faint silver glow, open ground where they might stand a chance of outmaneuvering the creature. The window, Arthur said, pointing. We'll climb out and head for the fields. If we can stay ahead of it long enough, maybe we can circle back to town. Nolan nodded, already moving to clear a path to the window. We'll need to move fast. Once we're out, we stick together. Another deafening crash from below sent a shudder through the house. The trapdoor quivered, the barricade straining under the creature's relentless force. Time was running out. Arthur grabbed an old curtain, tearing it into strips to fashion a makeshift rope. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Nolan pried open the window, the cool night air rushing in and carrying with it the faint rustle of the forest. He turned to Arthur, his expression grim. You go first. Jim, follow him. I'll bring up the rear. Arthur hesitated, his stomach twisting. But there was no room for fear now, only action. He climbed through the window, gripping the rope tightly as he lowered himself onto the sloped roof. The shingles were slick with moss, and his feet slipped as he scrambled for balance. Below him, the ground seemed impossibly far away. Jim followed, his movements clumsy and panicked. Nolan was last, his strong hands steady as he eased himself onto the roof. Just as they reached the edge, a deafening roar erupted from the attic, the trapdoor splintering in a final, violent crash. It's through! Jim screamed, his voice echoing into the night. Arthur didn't wait. He slid down the roof, landing hard in the damp grass below. The impact jolted through his legs, but he forced himself to his feet, helping Jim as he stumbled after him. Nolan landed a moment later, his face set in grim determination. "Run!" Nolan barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. They sprinted for the tree line, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. Behind them, the creature exploded through the attic window, its massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight. It let out a roar that shook the air, its glowing eyes locked on its fleeing prey. Arthur pushed himself harder, his lungs burning as he plunged into the forest. The trees closed around them, their branches like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. The forest seemed endless, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Arthur's legs screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when survival was so close, yet so far. Nolan's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. "Keep going. Don't stop." And so they ran, the forest swallowing them whole as the creature's relentless pursuit thundered in their ears. Its howls a haunting reminder that escape was anything but certain.